The rain came down in thick sheets, drumming against the cobbled streets of Paris. Inspector Jules Martin pulled his overcoat tight around his frame as he stepped out of his black Citroën, peering up at the dimly lit windows of the townhouse before him. Number 42, Rue Montmartre, an address now whispered in the precinct halls with the same mixture of curiosity and unease that accompanied unsolvable cases. The body had been found that morning. Monsieur Albert Renaud, a retired postmaster, had lived a quiet, meticulous life, his only extravagance a fondness for imported cigars and a habit of writing letters. Letters he never sent. A recluse by all accounts, but a harmless one. His housekeeper, Madame Lemoine, was the one who had raised the alarm when he failed to answer the door at his usual morning hour. Inside, the scene was perplexing. Renaud lay slumped over his writing. Desk a half-written letter under his lifeless fingers. The ink had barely dried when death had taken him. A heart attack? Poison? No obvious wounds, no sign of a struggle, except for one oddity. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows latched securely. Yet someone had been here. The writing desk was cluttered, but one item stood out, a single envelope, sealed and addressed, yet inexplicably empty. A letter that had never arrived. Martin approached the corpse, his sharp eyes tracing the details. Renaud's stiffened fingers still clutched his fountain pen. The ink bottle toppled over but unspilled. His pocket watch lay beside him, stopped at precisely 10:42 p.m. The housekeeper insisted she had left at 8, locking the front door behind her, as usual. If Renaud had suffered a natural death, who had been here to seal that empty envelope? He flipped it over, reading the name written in careful script. To H.G., 14 Rue Saint-Paul. The initials meant nothing to him. There was no letter inside, no sign of it anywhere in the house. Martin exhaled, already feeling the weight of the puzzle settling into his bones. A man found dead in a locked room, an undelivered letter, and a name that led nowhere. The beginning of a mystery that would not easily unravel. Inspector Jules Martin let the silence settle around him. The soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner was the only sound, steady and indifferent. The house smelled of old paper, ink, and faint traces of pipe smoke. Renaud's world, now frozen in time. Outside, the coroner's men waited, ready to transport the body, but Martin wasn't done yet. The officers had done their part, checking the locks, confirming statements, and searching for signs of forced entry. Everything pointed to a natural death, but Martin's instincts tugged at him. Something was wrong. He leaned over the writing desk, his gaze tracing the small, deliberate details of a life lived in precision. Renaud's handwriting, sharp and practiced, trailed off at the end of the unfinished letter. Whatever thought had been cut short had been important enough for his fingers to cling to the pen even in death. Yet it was the sealed envelope that held Martin's attention, a letter addressed, sealed, but empty. It wasn't just peculiar, it was deliberate. The name, H.G. at 14 Rue Saint-Paul, meant nothing to him yet, but it would. He was certain of that. He slipped the envelope into his coat pocket and turned his attention to the rest of the study. The bookshelves were orderly, the desk drawers locked, the wastebasket empty. A man of habit. Except Martin's gaze landed on the floor beside the desk. A small, almost imperceptible smudge near the base of the chair. He crouched, rubbing the mark between his fingers. Grease. Not from ink, not from dust. Something out of place. Inspector? A young officer, Dupont, stood at the door, shifting uneasily. What is it? "The housekeeper, Madame Lemoine. She's here. Says she needs to speak with you." Martin dusted his fingers on his handkerchief and stood. "Good. Let's see what she has to say." Madame Lemoine was waiting in the hallway, wringing her hands in the folds of her apron. Her round face, usually stern with the quiet authority of a woman who had spent decades managing other people's homes, was drawn tight with worry. "I told them," she said, as soon as Martin approached. "Told them it was just old age, but now—" She hesitated. "Now I don't know. Tell me exactly what you saw this morning." She inhaled, steadying herself. "I arrived at 8, as I always do. The door was locked as usual, but Monsieur Renou never answered. I knocked, I called, but nothing. I thought perhaps he had left early for an errand, but that wasn't like him. He never left before 9, so I went around the side to the kitchen door." "The kitchen door?" Martin frowned. "That was locked as well?" "Yes. Everything locked, everything in its place. But when I finally found the key and let myself in, he was there, at the desk, just as you saw him. At first, I thought he had fallen asleep, but then—" She trailed off, pressing a hand to her lips. Martin nodded, letting the silence sit between them. "Did you touch anything?" "No," she said quickly, then hesitated. "Only the letter opener. It was on the desk, but something about it—" She shook her head. It felt wrong. Martin's eyes sharpened. "Wrong how?" she hesitated. "It was placed too neatly, as if someone had set it there after using it. Monsieur Renou was particular, yes, but he always left things slightly askew, a habit. But this was too perfect. A misplaced item." Martin turned to Dupont. "Where is it now?" "In the evidence bag with the rest of his belongings." Martin nodded, his mind turning over the details. A sealed, empty letter. A mark of grease on the floor. A letter opener placed too deliberately. Not much, but enough to tell him this wasn't over. He looked back at Madame Lemoine. "Did Monsieur Renou have visitors last night?" She shook her head. "He rarely had visitors at all. The only people who ever came were the delivery boy and the tobacconist." "And the mail?" She blinked. "Mail?" "Yes." "Did he receive anything yesterday?" Her brow furrowed. "Not that I saw. Though, now that you mention it—" Martin waited. "He usually left letters out for me to post. Even if he never sent them, he liked the routine of it. But yesterday, nothing, not a single letter on the hall table. I thought it odd, but I didn't ask." Martin pulled the sealed, empty envelope from his pocket and held it up. This was on his desk, addressed, but nothing inside. Madame Lemoine's lips parted. "But that's not possible." "Why not?" "Because I dusted his desk yesterday morning. There were no letters. And if he had written it last night—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "Then where is the letter that was supposed to be inside?" Martin didn't answer. His mind was already moving ahead, past the empty envelope, past the letter opener placed, too precisely, to the mark of grease on the floor. Someone had been here. Someone had left no trace, except for the things they had tried too hard to put back in place. This wasn't just a death, this was a deception, and it had only just begun. Inspector Jules Martin stepped away from Madame Lemoine, his thoughts weaving together the details she had provided. The empty envelope, the displaced letter opener, the smudge of grease, pieces of a puzzle that did not yet form a full picture. But one thing was certain. Someone had been here. Someone had ensured that Albert Renault's last moments remained shrouded in ambiguity. He turned to Dupont. Who was the first officer on the scene? Sergeant Moreau, sir. He's outside with the others. Good. Bring him in. Moreau entered with the weary expression of a man accustomed to routine. He was competent, but not the type to question beyond what was obvious. He had likely taken one look at Renaud, slumped at his desk, and concluded the case was closed before it had even begun. "Sergeant," Martin greeted him, his voice measured. "You arrived before me. Walk me through what you saw." Moreau squared his shoulders. The housekeeper was waiting outside. "I let myself in, found the deceased, just as you did. No signs of struggle, no forced entry, nothing out of place." Martin's gaze flickered. "Nothing out of place?" Moreau hesitated. "Well, except for the letter opener, I suppose." Martin's fingers curled slightly. "You noticed it?" "It looked too neatly placed," Moreau admitted with a shrug. "But the doctor said heart failure, so I didn't see much reason to dwell on it." "You should have." Martin's tone was mild but pointed. "Did you touch anything?" "No, sir." Martin let the silence stretch between them before reaching into his coat and retrieving the sealed, empty envelope. "This was on the desk. Did you happen to notice if there was a letter inside?" Moreau frowned. "Didn't check. I assumed it was just part of his correspondence." Martin slid the envelope back into his pocket. "Did you notice anyone nearby when you arrived? Anyone loitering?" "No one suspicious," Moreau said, but then hesitated. "Though I did see the tobacconist, Jules Arno. He was across the street when I pulled up, watching the house." Martin's eyes sharpened. "Watching?" Moreau nodded. "Didn't say anything, just stood there. When I glanced back a few minutes later, he was gone." Martin turned to Dupont. "Find Arno. I want to speak with him." Within the hour, Dupont returned with the tobacconist, a wiry man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed moustache and eyes that darted with restless energy. Arno was eager to talk, almost too eager, as though he had rehearsed his words before stepping inside. "It's a terrible thing," he said, as he took a seat across from Martha. "Poor Renaud. I saw the police arrive and thought, something's wrong. But I didn't want to interfere." "You were watching the house." Martin's voice was casual, but his eyes remained steady. Arno hesitated just a beat too long. "Not watching exactly, just noticing." "Noticing what?" Arno's fingers tapped against his knee. Renaud was a regular customer, always came for his cigars, always at the same time, but yesterday he never showed up. "And that was unusual?" "Very." Arno's expression darkened. Renaud was a man of habit. He always came at 6 sharp, rain or shine. When he didn't come, I thought, well, maybe he's unwell. Then I saw the officers, and I knew something was wrong. Martin leaned forward slightly. "Did Renaud receive any visitors yesterday?" Arnaud's lips pressed together. "I wouldn't know." "You wouldn't know, or you won't say?" Arno bristled. "I don't spy on my neighbours, Inspector." Martin let his gaze rest on him for a long moment. "Do you know the name H.G. at 14 Rue Saint-Paul?" Arno blinked. His reaction was subtle, but there, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "Can't say I do." Martin didn't believe him. "If you think of anything," he said smoothly, "let me know." Arno left, and Martin watched through the window as the man hurried down the street, his posture rigid. There was something he wasn't saying. Madame Lemoine had claimed Renaud never had visitors, yet his tobacconist had noticed his absence immediately. And then there was the missing letter, written, sealed, but gone before it could be sent. By the time the sun had dipped below the Paris skyline, Dupont returned with another name. "Inspector," he said, setting his notebook down. "We checked 14 Rue Saint-Paul. It belongs to Henri Gautier." Martin's fingers tightened slightly. "H.G. Yes, sir. He runs a small printing press out of his home. When I mentioned Renou's name, he seemed rattled." Martin nodded, reaching for his coat. "Then let's pay Monsieur Gautier a visit." The pieces were shifting. Someone had tampered with the scene. Someone had taken the letter. And now someone was afraid. It was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. Inspector Jules Martin and Dupont stepped out of the car, the cold evening air sharp against their faces. The building at 14 Rue Saint-Paul was a modest structure, wedged between a bakery and a tailor's shop, its front marked by a simple wooden sign, Gautier and Sons, printers and stationers. A weak light glowed from inside, casting flickering shadows against the curtained windows. Martin rapped on the door. A shuffling sound followed before it creaked open just enough to reveal a thin, anxious face. "Henri Gautier, yes? Inspector Jules Martin, police." He held up his badge. "May we come in?" Gautier hesitated. His gaze darted behind them before he stepped back and motioned them inside. The small printing shop smelled of ink and old paper, the scent hanging heavy in the air. Stacks of neatly arranged stationery lined the walls, and a large iron printing press dominated the back of the room. Martin wasted no time. "Monsieur Gautier, do you know Albert Renaud?" Gautier wiped his hands on his apron. Yes, we spoke occasionally." "When was the last time you saw him?" "2 nights ago," he admitted, shifting on his feet. "He stopped by late, after I'd closed up." Martin exchanged a glance with Dupont. "What did he want?" Gautier hesitated. "A favor." Martin remained silent, letting the weight of the moment press down on him. Finally, Gautier exhaled. "He brought me a letter. He wanted it copied." Martin's pulse quickened. "Copied?" "Yes. He was insistent that I reproduce it exactly, every detail, even the paper and ink. He didn't say why, only that it was important." "And did you?" Gautier nodded. "I made 2 copies. He took one and left the other with me, saying he'd return for it. Do you still have it?" Gautier hesitated again, then walked to a locked drawer behind the counter. He fumbled with the key, his hands trembling slightly, as he pulled out a folded sheet of paper and handed it over. Martin unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting was precise, unmistakably Renou's. He read, "To H.G., if anything happens to me, know that I had no choice. They are watching. The letter must not reach him. Destroy it at once. No signature." Martin's mind raced. Renou hadn't just written a letter, he had copied one, which meant the original had been meant for someone else, and someone had wanted to make sure it was never received. He looked up sharply. "Who do you think they are?" Gautier swallowed. "I don't know. But when I saw the news this morning about Renou, I burned the copy I made." Martin's grip on the paper tightened. "Why?" "Because I was afraid." Martin studied him carefully. Fear lined the man's face, real and raw. "You knew. This letter put him in danger, I suspected. Did anyone else know about it?" Gautier hesitated, then nodded. "Jules Arno, the tobacconist." Martin's jaw clenched. "How does he fit into this?" Gautier exhaled slowly. "He was here when Renou came by. He overheard part of the conversation. After Renou left, he asked me what it was about. I didn't tell him. But Arno had been watching Renou's house, watching the police. He had known something was wrong before anyone else. Martin turned toward Dupont. "We need to speak to Arno again, now." They left Gautier pale and shaken, locking up behind them. The night had deepened, the streets quieter now, but Martin's mind was loud with possibilities. Someone had killed Renaud. Not for money, not in passion, but for a letter. A letter that had been copied and now, perhaps, still existed. Arno's shop was dark when they arrived, its shutters drawn. Martin knocked sharply. No answer. He knocked again. Still nothing. He exchanged a glance with Dupont, then tried. "The door. Locked. We'll come back first thing in the morning," Dupont suggested. Martin wasn't so sure. The fear in Gautier's eyes lingered in his mind. Something was moving in the shadows, and every step they took brought them closer to disturbing it. "Wait here," he muttered, stepping around the side of the building. The alleyway behind the shop was narrow, lined with crates and discarded papers. He tested the back door, unlocked. He pushed it open cautiously. The scent of stale smoke clung to the air. The shop was silent, but something felt off. Then he saw it, a chair overturned, papers scattered, and there, in the dim light of a flickering gas lamp, Jules Arno slumped over his counter, a thin red line across his throat. The tobacconist would never speak again. The air inside the tobacconist's shop was thick with the scent of spilled ink and stale tobacco, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Inspector Jules Martin stood motionless, his sharp gaze sweeping across the dimly lit space. Jules Arno's body lay slumped over the counter, his lifeless eyes fixed on nothing. The thin red line across his throat was clean, precise. Whoever had done this had been efficient. Dupont, standing just behind Martin, let out a slow breath. "Merde!" Martin stepped forward carefully, his boots avoiding the papers scattered across the floor. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned furniture beyond the fallen chair. Arno had either known his attacker or never had the chance to react. His hand still clutched something, a crumpled scrap of paper. Martin pried it loose and unfolded it. A single word was scrawled across it in hasty, uneven handwriting. "Ruel?" "A name?" Dupont asked, peering over his shoulder. "Or a place," Martin murmured. His thoughts raced. Arno had been involved in Renaud's secret. He had known something, perhaps too much. Now he was dead, just as Renaud had died. The door burst open behind them, and Sergeant Moreau entered with 2 officers. His face hardened at the sight of Arno's body. "Another one?" Martin ignored the question, tucking the scrap of paper into his coat. "Who found him?" "The neighbor," Moreau answered grimly. "He came to borrow a light, found the back door open and saw—" He gestured at the body. No one heard anything. "Because there was nothing to hear," Martin said. "This wasn't a fight. It was an execution." Moreau sighed. "We need to take him in. Do you have any idea who might have done this?" Martin glanced at the scattered papers, the small pool of blood forming beneath the counter. A few facts were coming into focus, but something remained just out of reach. Someone who wanted him silenced, and someone who knew how to kill quickly. By dawn, word of Arno's murder had spread. The newspapers were already printing dramatic headlines, linking his death to Renaud's and whispering of a conspiracy. The pressure on the police was mounting. Then, in a stroke of seeming fortune, an arrest was made. Dupont found Martin in his office, holding up a crumpled sheet of paper. "They caught someone," Martin raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Dupont nodded. Jean Ruel, a small-time thief with a record of violence. He was picked up early this morning trying to pawn a gold watch. Martin straightened. A watch? Renou's. Silence stretched between them. The implication was clear. Ruel had been in possession of a stolen item from the first victim. It was damning evidence, enough to close the case in the eyes of the authorities. They say he killed Renou in a robbery gone wrong, Dupont continued. And when Arno got too close to the truth, he silenced him too. Martin exhaled slowly.
How convenient, Dupont hesitated.
You don't believe it? Martin stood, his fingers drumming against his desk. I believe Ruel is a thief, but a killer? A man like that doesn't leave such clean work. Renou's death wasn't a robbery, it was calculated, and Arno's was an execution. Why would Ruel slit his throat and then go pawn a stolen watch? Dupont frowned. Then why did he have the watch? Martin turned to the window, staring out at the early morning bustle of Paris. The city was waking up, unaware that the real danger still lurked in the shadows, because someone gave it to him. Dupont stiffened. You think he's a scapegoat? Martin nodded. Someone needed the case closed. Someone needed us to stop looking. Moreau arrived shortly after, his expression triumphant. Ruel confessed. Martin's head snapped toward him. What? Moreau smirked. Sang like a bird. Said he broke into Renou's home, found the old man writing at his desk, panicked, and strangled him. Then, when he heard the tobacconist knew something, he silenced him too. Martin studied Moreau's face. Did you hear him confess yourself? Moreau hesitated, then shook his head. No, but the officers who questioned him say he was shaking. He knew he was caught. Martin didn't answer. He needed to see Ruel himself. The holding cells beneath the station were dimly lit and smelled of damp stone. Ruel sat in a corner, his wrists shackled, his face bruised from what Martin suspected had been a persuasive interrogation. Martin stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Jean Ruel," he said, keeping his voice level. "Tell me about the watch." Ruel licked his cracked lips. "What's there to tell? You stole it?" A pause. Then, "Yeah? From Renou's house?" Another pause, just long enough. "Yeah." Martin crouched slightly, bringing himself to Ruel's eye level. "You don't sound convinced." Ruel swallowed. "Look, He glanced at the door. "I ain't saying nothing more." Martin's pulse quickened. Ruel had been given the watch, and someone had made sure he took the fall. He rose to his feet. "I'll be back." Back in his office, Dupont was waiting. "Well?" "He's lying," Martin said flatly. "Or rather, he's reciting a lie. Someone put that confession in his mouth." Dupont exhaled. "The case is closed, Jules. The papers are calling it solved. They want this over." Martin stared at his desk, where the single word from Arno's clenched fist still sat. Ruel. It had never been a suspect's name. It had been a warning. The real killer was still out there. And they were watching. Martin sat in his office, staring at the single word scrawled on the paper. Ruel. It wasn't a name. It wasn't even a suspect. It was a clue, a warning left by a dying man. But a warning about what? The weight of the so-called confession sat heavy in his mind. Jean Ruel might have been a thief, but he wasn't a killer. Someone had fed him a story and made sure he took the blame. That meant the real murderer was still walking free, and they were confident enough to tie up loose ends. Dupont entered without knocking, his coat dusted with the morning's chill. The higher-ups are satisfied. The papers are calling it a solved case, but I take it you're not convinced. Attigny exhaled slowly. Someone planted Renou's watch on Ruel Dupont. Someone made sure we found it, then persuaded him to confess. Dupont crossed his arms. So who? Martin leaned forward, tapping his fingers against his desk. I don't know yet. But Arno left us a message before he died. Ruel? What if it isn't about Jean Ruel? What if it's a place? Dupont frowned. A street, you mean? Martin reached for the city directory on the shelf behind him, flipping quickly through the pages. His finger stopped on a listing. Rue de la Ruelle, 4th arrondissement. His pulse quickened. There. Dupont leaned in. A small street near the Seine. Doesn't look like much, but it meant something to Arno, Martin said. We need to find out why. By the time they arrived at Rue de la Ruelle, the narrow street was just waking up. A few shops lined the cobbled road, an old bookshop, a locksmith, a cafe, with its chairs still stacked. Martin's gaze swept across the buildings, looking for anything out of place. It was the sign above a weathered storefront that made him stop. Librairie Marchand, Esteter 1892. A bookshop. Renou had been a bookseller. Could it be coincidence? He pushed open the door. A small bell chimed, and the scent of dust and old paper filled the air. Behind the counter, a woman in her 60s adjusted her spectacles and peered at him. Can I help you, messieurs? Martin stepped forward. Inspector Jules Martin. We're investigating a matter concerning Albert Renou. Her face changed. Something flickered in her eyes, something cautious. Renou? It's been years since I've heard that name. Dupont raised an eyebrow. You knew him? She nodded slowly. He used to come here often. He loved rare books, old documents. He would spend hours in the back, searching through things most people would never look twice at. Martin's mind sharpened. When was the last time you saw him? She hesitated, then said, A week ago. Martin and Dupont exchanged a glance. This was significant. What was he looking for? She sighed, running a hand over the wooden counter. It was unusual. He asked for records, old property deeds, specifically from the late 1800s. I told him we had some archived in the back, and he spent nearly an hour searching. When he left, he seemed troubled. Martin's heartbeat quickened. Do you remember what he found? The woman hesitated, then disappeared into the back room. A few minutes later, she returned, holding a faded, yellowed sheet of paper. This is a copy of one of the deeds he was looking at. Martin took it carefully. The parchment was fragile, the ink faded but legible. The document detailed ownership of a building on Rue de la Ruelle. His eyes moved down the page until he saw the name of the original owner. Gustave Arno. Dupont inhaled sharply. Arno! Martin's mind raced. Gustave Arno, a relative of Jules Arno, the murdered tobacconist. And why had Renou been digging? Through old property records just days before his death? Martin turned back to the bookseller. Do you know what happened to this property? She nodded. It burned down decades ago. There was a fire, one of the worst in the district. The building was abandoned after that. No one ever rebuilt. Martin felt the weight of something long buried beginning to surface. A fire. A lost property. A forgotten name. Renou had uncovered something tied to the past, something dangerous enough to get him killed. They left the shop with the deed in hand. As they stepped back onto the street, Dupont muttered, "This isn't about Renou's."
Death at all, is it? Martin's jaw tightened. No, this is about whatever secret he uncovered.
A crime buried in the ashes of the past had just risen from the grave. The yellowed deed felt like a relic from another time, yet it carried the weight of something dangerously current. Martin and Dupont stood at the edge of Rue de la Ruelle, staring at what had once been the property in question. It was nothing now, a vacant lot, long overgrown with weeds and strewn with rubble. The fire that had consumed the building decades ago had erased nearly all traces of its past, but Martin knew that secrets buried in ashes had a way of lingering. Dupont kicked at a loose stone. A fire from years ago, a dead bookseller, a murdered tobacconist and a thief forced into confession. There's a connection here, but it's tangled. Martin glanced down at the document again, his fingers tracing the faded name. Gustave Arno, a relative of the tobacconist, Jules Arno. That much was clear, but why had Renou, a quiet, bookish man, been digging into this history just before his death? And who had wanted to stop him? He folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his coat. We need to talk to someone who remembers this fire. Finding someone old enough to recall the incident was easier than expected. At a nearby cafe, an elderly man hunched over a cup of black coffee, watching the street with the patience of someone who had seen decades pass by. His name was Louis Marchand, the retired locksmith whose shop still stood on the corner. When Martin and Dupont approached him with polite inquiries about the fire, Marchand rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "The Arno fire? That was a long time ago. I was just a boy when it happened, but I remember the night well. People said it started in the cellar, some accident, they thought, but there were rumors." Martin leaned forward. "What kind of
Rumors? Marchand exhaled slowly, as if dredging up the past took effort. That it wasn't an accident. That Gustave Arno had enemies. Enemies?
Dupont asked. The old man nodded. He was a businessman, owned property, rented it out, made money, but there were whispers that not all his dealings were clean. Some said he had hidden investments. Martin's instincts sharpened. Hidden. How? Marchand gave a small shrug. Money changing hands without records, names on paper that shouldn't be there. If someone wanted to erase proof of something, well, a fire is a very thorough way to do it. Martin's pulse quickened. A destroyed building, a missing record, and Renou, a bookseller obsessed with old documents, had stumbled upon something dangerous enough to get him killed. But there was still something missing. A piece that refused to fit. Back at the station, Martin spread out everything they had. On his desk, Renou's notes, the old property deed, the crime reports. He needed something new, something unexpected. He glanced at Dupont. "I want to speak to Jean Ruel again." Dupont frowned. "Why? He's already confessed." "He's been coached," Martin corrected. "But there's something off about it. I want to see how he reacts when we throw something new at him." They found Ruel in his holding cell, slouched against the wall, looking sullen. His bruises had darkened, evidence of a forced confession. When Martin entered, the thief barely looked up. Martin stepped closer, voice calm but firm. "I want to ask you something, Ruel, and I suggest you think very carefully before you answer." Ruel scoffed. "What difference does it make? You already got what you wanted." Martin ignored him. Instead, he pulled out the old property deed and unfolded it slowly, letting the yellowed paper catch the dim light. "Ever seen this before?" Ruel's eyes flicked to the document, and for the briefest second his expression changed. It wasn't recognition, it was fear. Martin caught it. "You have, haven't you?" Ruel stiffened. "No, never seen
it before." "You're lying," Martin said smoothly. "I can see it in your face." Ruel scowled. "I don't know what you're talking about."
Martin took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Someone gave you Renault's watch, Ruel. Someone fed you a story and told you to confess. But whoever that person is, they don't care what happens to you. They'll throw you away just like they threw Renault away." Ruel clenched his jaw. Martin pressed on. "If you don't tell me the truth now, the real killer wins, and you rot in a cell for their crime." For a long moment, Ruel was silent. Then, finally, he exhaled sharply.
"I didn't kill anyone." Martin nodded. "Who gave you the watch?" Ruel swallowed. "A man, I don't know his name. He found me 2 nights ago outside a tavern, told me there was a way to make easy money, gave me the watch, said to pawn it, and if the police picked me up, to say I killed the old man."
Dupont cursed under his breath. Martin remained calm. "What did he look like?" Ruel hesitated. "Tall, maybe 40, 50, sharp face. But I didn't get a good look." Martin exchanged a glance with Dupont. A middle-aged man, someone who knew how to manipulate people, someone connected to all of this. Then Ruel said something that made Martin's blood run cold. "He had a ring," Ruel muttered. "A gold one, with an engraving." Martin's voice was steady. "What kind of engraving?" Ruel frowned, trying to remember. "A symbol, something old-fashioned, like a crest." Martin's pulse pounded. A family crest, a symbol of lineage, a mark of inheritance, a connection to the past. The web was tightening, and someone powerful, was watching. The weight of Ruel's words settled heavily in the room. A gold ring, an engraving, a family crest. Martin could feel the shape of the truth beginning to take form, but it remained just out of
reach, obscured by layers of deception. Someone had orchestrated this entire affair, manipulated Renault, framed Ruel, and ensured that anyone who got too close was silenced.
And now they knew Martin was closing in. He stepped out of the holding cell, Dupont close behind. The station was alive with the low murmur of officers and the shuffle of paperwork, but something in the air had shifted. The unease clung to Martin's skin like damp wool. He pulled the old property deed from his coat and stared at the faded ink. This document, this relic of a fire long past, was dangerous. Renault had found something hidden in history, something someone was willing to kill for, and Martin had no doubt that whoever was behind it knew he had this paper now. They had to move quickly. "We need to check the archives," Martin muttered to Dupont. "If Renault was looking for old records, there may be more. Something that connects the past to the present." The archives were housed in a quiet building adjacent to the police headquarters, a place of dust and forgotten paperwork. The clerk, a rail-thin man with pince-nez glasses, gave them a weary look as they entered. "We need access to fire records," Martin said, "specifically property holdings before and after the Arno fire." The clerk frowned but nodded, disappearing into the dimly lit rows of cabinets. Martin glanced at Dupont. "If we find out who took control of the land after the fire, we find our connection." Minutes passed before the clerk returned, a thin ledger tucked under his arm. He set it on the desk with a soft thump, flipping through brittle pages with practiced precision. Then he stopped. "Here," he murmured, Tapping the page, Martin leaned in. The record detailed the ownership transfer of the Arno property after the fire. The original deed belonged to Gustave Arno, but after the fire, the land had been purchased by Etienne Varnier. Martin's breath caught. The name was familiar. A prominent businessman in his time, a man who had dealings across the city, but one name alone wouldn't be enough. He scanned further. The property had changed hands again years later, sold quietly, without much documentation. The buyer's name was one Martin had not expected. Henri de Cresac Dupont let out a slow whistle. Cresac, that's not just any name? No, Martin murmured. It's a name that carries influence. The Cresac family had been entrenched in wealth and power for generations. If Henri de Cresac had acquired the ruined Arno property, then someone from his family might still be involved. And if this tied to the ring Ruel described, then Martin had just found his missing link. He carefully closed the ledger. We
need to... A sudden commotion erupted from the main office. Shouts, the sound of hurried footsteps. Martin spun around just in time to see a young officer sprinting toward them, his face flushed. "Inspector,"
he panted. "Your office! Someone—" Martin was already moving. Dupont was at his side as they stormed into the station. His office door was ajar. The handle still swung slightly as if recently disturbed. Inside, the air felt wrong. Stale.
Invaded. The papers on his desk were scattered, drawers yanked open. The deed! Martin's heart pounded as he reached for his coat pocket. But he already knew.
It was gone. The old document that had led them this far, the proof that had survived decades, had vanished. Dupont swore under his breath, scanning the room. Who the hell got in here? Martin's mind was already racing. This wasn't a common break-in. It was too precise, too focused. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for. A warning. His fists clenched. They weren't just covering their tracks. They were sending a message. The stakes had just risen, and the enemy was watching. The office still smelled of stale tobacco and ink, but now there was something else, an unease that crawled beneath Martin's skin. The missing deed was no coincidence. Someone had been watching, waiting for the precise
moment to strike. Whoever had orchestrated this cover-up wasn't just cleaning up loose ends.
They were controlling the game, staying several steps ahead. Dupont exhaled sharply, scanning the ransacked office. They knew exactly what they were looking for. Martin nodded. The old property deed was the key to something Renaud had stumbled upon before his murder. And now, just as the investigation gained momentum, it was gone. But theft wasn't enough for someone this meticulous. The logical step, the next move, would be something drastic. A second crime, a sharp knock on the doorframe made both men turn. A junior officer stood there, face pale. "Inspector, there's been another murder." The words landed like a blow. Martin was already grabbing his coat. Who? Louis Marchand, the locksmith, the old man who had remembered the Arno fire. The one who had given them the first real glimpse into what had happened all those years ago. Martin and Dupont moved fast, cutting through the damp Paris streets, their footsteps pounding against cobblestones. The crime scene was barely a few blocks away from Marchand's cafe. A narrow alleyway, the kind easily overlooked in the maze of the city. The old locksmith lay crumpled against the stone wall, his grey coat stained dark with blood. Martin crouched beside the body, taking in every detail. A single stab wound to the chest, no signs of struggle, a clean, efficient kill. He checked the old man's pockets, nothing missing. Not a robbery, then. A message? Dupont stood back, jaw tight. He talked to us this morning. And now he's dead, Martin murmured. His mind raced. Whoever did this is accelerating their plan. They know we're getting close. A small, folded slip of paper was tucked into Marchand's palm. Carefully, Martin eased it out, unfolding the damp sheet. 4 words were scrawled in ink. Stop looking into Cresac. Dupont swore under his breath. The name confirmed what they already suspected. Henri de Cresac, or someone tied to his legacy, was at the center of this. But Martin knew what this note really meant. They weren't just solving a crime anymore. They were trying to prevent the next one. Martin rose to his feet. We need to find Cresac's son. Henri de Cresac was long dead. His business dealings had faded into obscurity, but his family remained. The heir, Philippe de Cresac, was a quiet, reclusive man, a collector of rare artifacts, a patron of the arts, a man whose name rarely appeared in the papers, yet one who held quiet influence over the city. And now, a man with something to hide. It was time for a conversation. They reached the Cresac estate just as dusk settled over the city. The mansion loomed behind an iron gate, its windows dark, its gardens perfectly manicured but lifeless, a home that held secrets in its walls. Martin and Dupont approached the front door, rapping firmly against the wood. Moments passed before the door creaked open. A butler, expression carefully neutral, regarded them with polite disinterest. Philippe de Cresac, Martin said. We need to speak with him. The butler hesitated. Monsieur de Cresac does not receive unannounced visitors. Dupont gave a dry chuckle. He does tonight? Before the man could protest, Martin stepped forward. It concerns a murder. That changed everything. The butler's jaw tightened, but he nodded, stepping aside. The interior was grand, but cold, high ceilings, polished marble, a space meant to impress rather than comfort. The butler led them down a long hall, stopping before a heavy wooden door. He knocked once before pushing it open. Philippe de Cresac sat behind a mahogany desk, a glass of wine untouched beside him. He was in his early 50s, his hair greying. At the temples, his suit perfectly pressed. His expression was one of mild curiosity, as if the presence of 2 detectives in his home was merely a passing inconvenience. Gentlemen, he greeted smoothly, to what do I owe the pleasure? Martin studied him carefully. Louis Marchand was murdered an hour ago. Cresac's expression didn't change. Unfortunate. Someone left a note on his body, Martin continued. With your name
On it. That got a reaction. Subtle, but there. A flicker in the eyes, a brief tightening of the jaw.
A man trained in maintaining composure, but not immune to being caught off guard. I fail to see how that concerns me, Cresac said. Martin pulled out the slip of paper and placed it on the desk. You might want to reconsider. A pause, then a slow smile. Inspector, you seem to believe I had something to do with this. I believe your family's past has something to do with it, Martin corrected. Gustave Arno's property, the fire, the way that land was quietly acquired, and now 2 men are dead, both of whom knew something about it. Cresac exhaled, setting his wineglass down with careful precision. Old business dealings are hardly a motive for murder. Not unless those dealings involved something worth killing for, Martin countered. Renou was searching for something, records, proof of ownership, something tied to the past. He was silenced before he could find it. He leaned in. Tell me, Philippe, what was worth enough to burn a building to the ground? Silence. Then Cresac smiled again, but this time it didn't reach his eyes. I think we're done here, Inspector. Martin held his gaze. He'd seen this before, men of power who thought themselves untouchable. But Cresac had made a mistake. He had reacted, and Martin had seen it. As they turned to leave, Martin spoke over his shoulder. "One more thing." Cresac arched a brow. "The man who gave Jean Ruel the watch," Martin said. "He wore a gold ring with a family crest." He paused, letting the words settle. "Would you happen to know anything about that?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Martin didn't wait for a response. He stepped out into the cold night air, Dupont close behind. "That wasn't just a conversation," Dupont muttered. "That was a warning," Martin nodded. "And now we wait to see what he does next." Because the killer was running out of options. And when men like Cresac got desperate, they made mistakes. The carriage ride back to the station was silent, but Martin's mind was anything but. Every detail of their conversation with Philippe de Cresac played over in his thoughts, shifting, rearranging, searching for the missing piece. The stolen deed, the Arno fire, the gold ring. Cresac had reacted when he heard about the watch. Subtly, yes, but enough. Dupont broke the silence. "He knows more than he's letting on." "Of course he does," Martin said, staring out
at the rain-slick streets. "But there's something else, something we're missing."
The carriage jolted to a stop in front of the station, and as they stepped out, a runner approached them, breathless. "Inspector, another message. This one's for you." Martin took the envelope, the paper damp from the misty air. No return address, just his name written in careful script. He tore it open. "If you truly want the truth, go back to where it began. Midnight. Come alone." Dupont read over his shoulder. "A trap," Martin nodded, "but one we can't ignore. Midnight. Found him standing in front of the ruins of the old Arno property, the skeletal remains of the burned-out building looming in the moonlight. It had been abandoned for years, left to decay, except for the faint glow of a lantern flickering inside. He stepped carefully over fallen beams and charred stone, moving toward the light. A figure stood near the back wall, half hidden in shadow. As Martin approached, the person stepped forward. It was Léon Girard, the aging notary who had first pointed them toward the missing deed. Martin's pulse quickened. "You sent the note," Girard nodded, his face worn and drawn. "I should have spoken sooner." Martin studied him. "Then speak now." Girard sighed, gesturing around them. "This place, it was never meant to be rebuilt. Not after what happened." "The fire." Girard nodded. "Gustave Arno didn't die in the fire, Inspector. He was dead before the flames were set." The words hung in the air, changing everything. Martin's breath steadied. "How do you know this?" "I saw the real documents," Girard said. "The ones that were destroyed that night." Arno had uncovered something that Cresac and his associates couldn't allow to come to light. He hesitated. "There was another name on the papers."
"One that has been buried ever since." Martin's pulse quickened. "Whose name?" Before Girard could answer, a sudden rustling came from behind them. Then a shot rang out. Girard gasped, staggering back as blood bloomed across his chest. Martin lunged forward, catching him as he collapsed. But the old man's grip on his coat was weak, his breath fading fast. "Name," Martin urged. "Tell me." Girard's lips moved, the last of his strength spent on a single word. Then he went still.
Martin lowered him gently, then spun toward the darkness. A figure moved through the shadows, vanishing into the ruins before he could give chase. A second witness silenced, another piece of the past buried, but Girard had said a name. Martin replayed the whisper in his mind. It wasn't Cresac. It was Benoit. Something shifted inside him, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Benoit was not a common name, and there was only one Benoit he knew connected to this case. Jules Benoit, the butler, Philippe de Cresac's trusted servant, the man who had stood by silently as they questioned his employer, who had ushered them out without a second glance. Martin had spent the entire investigation looking at the men who benefited from the past. But what if the truth lay with someone? Who had witnessed it instead? Someone who had lived in the shadows, seen things no one was meant to see? Someone who had spent decades keeping a secret. The pattern was finally clear, and Martin knew exactly where to go next. Martin didn't waste time. The moment he left the ruins of the Arno estate, he instructed Dupont to arrange a quiet watch on Cresac's townhouse. Not for Cresac himself, but for Jules Benoit. The butler had been too quiet, too unobtrusive, a man accustomed to being overlooked. But now, with Léon Girard's dying breath revealing his name, Martin knew that whatever had been set into motion years ago, Benoit had been a part of it, maybe even the catalyst. By the time Martin reached Cresac's home, the grand estate was bathed in the pale glow of street lamps. The house was dark, but a single light burned from within, a faint glow in a study near the back. He knocked once, then again. The door creaked open slightly, and there he was. Jules Benoit, standing stiffly in his uniform, his expression a careful mask of deference. "Inspector?" he greeted, his voice smooth and steady. "It's rather late for inquiries." Martin stepped forward, forcing Benoit to retreat slightly. "Late or not, I believe you and I need to talk." Benoit hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping aside. "If you insist." The butler led him into the study where books lined the walls and a decanter of brandy sat untouched on the desk. Benoit moved with practiced ease, pouring a drink for himself without offering one to Martin. That, in itself, was telling. Martin studied the man as he took a sip, his age-lined face, his precise, measured movements. He had served Cresac for decades, a loyal shadow. But how deep did that loyalty run? Martin spoke slowly. "Léon Girard is dead." Benoit didn't blink. "Unfortunate. Shot moments after telling me that Gustave Arno was murdered before the fire." Again, no reaction.
"That is a serious accusation, Inspector." Martin leaned forward slightly. "And he gave me a name before he died. Your name, Benoit." This time there was a flicker, a tightening around the eyes, a moment of calculation. But when Benoit spoke, his voice remained calm.
"I fail to see how I would have anything to do with such a matter." Martin wasn't interested in the games. He had spent too long unraveling the threads of this case, and now the entire picture was finally coming into focus. "You were there, weren't you?" Martin pressed. "That night, the night of the fire." Benoit's hand stilled on his glass. "I was in the service of the household, yes. And yet, you never mentioned it. Not once during the investigation." Benoit sighed softly and set his glass down with deliberate care. "Because I had nothing to say." "That's not true," Martin countered. "You've had everything to say. You've simply chosen not to." The butler's shoulders remained squared, but something in his stance shifted, as though he had been expecting this moment for years.
Martin continued. "You're not just a butler, are you? You never were. You were something else to them, to Cresac, to Arno." Benoit was silent.
Martin took another step closer. You knew Arno was going to expose Cresac. You knew he had the documents proving that the land had been stolen, that the entire foundation of Cresac's wealth was built on a lie, and you knew that if those documents saw the light of day, Cresac would lose everything. Benoit finally exhaled a long, measured breath, and then, at last, he spoke. "I wasn't protecting him," he murmured. His voice was softer now, but there was a weight to it, a weariness. "I was protecting her." Martin frowned. "Who?" For the first time, Benoit met his gaze directly. "Madame Cresac," he said. The words hung heavy in the air. Martin's mind raced. The widow. She had never been central to the case, always spoken of in passing. She had died years after the fire, of natural causes. There had been nothing suspicious about her. But Benoit's words changed everything. "You mean to tell me," Martin said slowly, "that she was involved?" Benoit shook his head. "Not in the way you think?" Martin waited. Benoit's fingers traced the rim of his glass absently. "She was everything to me," he admitted. "Long before she ever married Cresac. We were close once, but she was the daughter of a noble family. I was the son of a servant. She had no choice in her marriage." Martin remained silent, letting the man speak. "She was unhappy," Benoit continued, his voice quieter now. "She knew what kind of man her husband was. She knew what he had done, what he was capable of. And when she found out about the stolen land, about Arno's proof, she made a decision. A slow understanding crept into Martin's thoughts. "She told you?" Benoit nodded. "She told me, and she begged me to stop it, to protect her. I had no choice." Martin exhaled. "So you silenced Arno?" "No," Benoit said, shaking his head. "I didn't kill him, but I was there when it happened." He paused. "It was Cresac. He's the one who struck the fatal blow. But it was her who ordered the fire." Martin felt a chill run through him. "She didn't want him exposed," Benoit murmured. "Because if Cresac fell, so did she. The scandal, the ruin, it would have destroyed her. So she told me to make sure the evidence was gone. And I obeyed. A missing piece had finally fallen into place. This wasn't just about land or wealth. This was about love, about devotion, twisted into something unrecognizable. "She's been dead for years," Martin said. "Why keep the secret now?" Benoit gave a sad smile. "Because I loved her, and love makes fools of us all." Martin studied the man for a long moment. He wasn't innocent, far from it. But he wasn't the monster behind it all either. He was a man who had spent a lifetime serving others, and in the end, he had given everything for the one person he had ever truly cared for. And now, all that was left was the truth, a truth that finally could no longer be buried. Martin studied Benoit for a long moment, the weight of the man's confession pressing into the silence of the room. The butler did not plead or bargain. There was an air of resignation about him, as if he had been waiting for this reckoning for years. Outside, the gaslights flickered against the window panes, their glow wavering in the damp Parisian night. The case had felt like an endless labyrinth, but now the final corridor was in sight. "I need you to come with me," Martin said at last. Benoit exhaled, setting his glass down gently, his hands steady. "Of course," he murmured. "There's nothing left to hide," but just as Martin reached for the door, there was a shift in the air. A shadow moved in the hallway. Then,
a gunshot, the sound cracked through the quiet, and Martin instinctively ducked, spinning toward the source. Benoit staggered, a sharp gasp escaping his lips as he clutched his side, sinking against the desk. Blood bloomed dark against his vest. Martin's
gun was already in his hand as he stepped into the hallway, his eyes sweeping the darkness. A figure stood at the far end, shrouded in shadow. Then a flicker of light caught their face as they turned, just for a second. Cresac. His mouth was set in a grim line, the gun still raised, smoke curling from the barrel. Martin didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, but Cresac was already moving, retreating through the back entrance. Martin's boots thundered against the floor as he pursued, bursting into the damp courtyard beyond. Cresac ran with the desperation of a man who knew he
had nothing left to lose. His coat flared behind him as he reached the garden gate, shoving it open with his shoulder. Martin raised his revolver, aiming for the leg. Another shot rang out, but it wasn't Martin's. Cresac jerked to the side, stumbling before crashing to his knees. His fingers twitched around the gun as he tried to lift it again, but his strength failed. Martin's gaze snapped toward the source of the shot. Benoit. He stood in the doorway, pale and swaying, his own revolver clutched tightly in his bloody hands. He had dragged himself from the study, from his own injury, for this. Cresac let out a ragged breath, half laugh, half cough. "You old fool," he rasped. "You should have stayed out of it." Benoit stepped forward, his eyes locked onto the man he had once served. "I spent my life serving cowards like you," he said, his voice shaking with fury. "No more." Martin quickly approached, kicking the gun from Cresac's grip. The older man groaned but didn't resist as Martin hauled him onto his back, pressing a firm hand against the wound in his shoulder. "It's over, Cresac," Martin said. The Baron let out a ragged chuckle, his breath shallow. "Is it?" he whispered. "We all burn in the end, Inspector." Martin ignored him, turning his attention to Benoit, who had slumped against the doorframe, his breathing laboured. "You need a doctor," Martin said, moving toward him. Benoit shook his head weakly. "I've made my peace," but Martin wouldn't accept that. He caught the butler under the arm, supporting his weight. "You're going to live," he said firmly. "You're going to tell the world what really happened." Benoit's lips twitched into the ghost of a smile. "And then," Martin tightened his grip, "and then you'll finally be free." The night had settled into an eerie stillness. The rush of adrenaline from the chase, the gunfire, and the capture had ebbed, leaving behind only the damp chill of the Parisian air and the faint, distant hum of the city. Martin stood over Cresac, watching as the Baron's breathing turned shallow, his once arrogant features now contorted in pain. The gendarmes arrived minutes later, their hurried steps crunching against the gravel. Cresac was quickly taken into custody, his protests reduced to bitter murmurs. Benoit, still weak from his wound, was helped into a carriage bound for the hospital. It should have been over, and yet, as Martin stood in the courtyard, something gnawed at him. The case had played out too neatly, too perfectly, as if following a script. Cresac had been the obvious villain, the corrupt nobleman desperate to cover his tracks. But was he the mastermind? Martin turned back toward the house, his sharp gaze scanning the dimly lit windows. His thoughts twisted and turned, picking apart the details of the case. The letter, the one that had never arrived, the one that had set everything in motion. Something didn't fit.
He walked back inside, retracing his steps through the grand corridors of the estate. The study where Benoit had been shot was untouched, save for the dark stain of blood on the carpet. Martin's eyes fell upon the desk where a half-drunk glass of cognac still sat beside scattered papers. He reached down, fingers grazing the edge of a small envelope, its seal broken. His pulse quickened. It was addressed to the late Monsieur Delacroix. The missing letter. Martin carefully unfolded the page, his eyes scanning the words. It wasn't a confession, nor was it a desperate plea for help. It was something far more chilling, a transaction. Delacroix had been blackmailing someone, not Cresac. His fingers tightened around the paper. The sum of money mentioned was substantial, enough to ruin someone if the truth were exposed. And there, at the bottom of the letter, was a name that sent a jolt through Martin's chest: Madeleine Vautrin, the Baroness. Martin's mind raced. She had played the grieving widow well, perhaps too well, always present, but never the focus, always cooperative, but never offering more than necessary. He had taken her sorrow at face value, but now he saw the cracks, the small hesitations, the careful omissions. Cresac had been protecting someone, but it hadn't been himself. It had been her. The realization sent a chill down Martin's spine. He turned abruptly, moving swiftly down the hallway toward her. Chambers. The door was slightly ajar, candlelight flickering within. He stepped inside, and there she was, standing by the vanity, her hands clasped before her. "You found it," she murmured, her voice unreadable. Martin held up the letter. "Delacroix was blackmailing you." She let out a slow breath, turning to face him fully. There was no shock in her expression, no attempt at denial. Instead, she tilted her head, considering him. "I wondered if you would put it together." Tam took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You killed him?" A faint smile touched her lips. "No," she said softly. "I didn't." He studied her, waiting. She exhaled, moving toward a small cabinet and retrieving a bottle of wine. With careful precision, she poured herself a glass. Delacroix had discovered something that would ruin me, a secret I had buried for years. She paused, swirling the wine in her glass. He wanted money, and I would have paid it. But someone else intervened before I had the chance. "Benoit," Martin said quietly. Her smile faded. "Yes." Martin felt a slow, sinking realization. It wasn't just loyalty, was it? Madeleine set down her glass, her fingers tightening against the stem. "Benoit and I, we had a past. A long time ago, before I married into wealth, before society dictated who I was supposed to be. We were young, foolish." Her voice grew distant. "But in this world, love isn't enough. I chose security, and he stayed in the shadows, watching over me even when I didn't ask him to." Martin closed his eyes briefly. The truth was painfully clear now. Benoit had killed Delacroix not for himself, not for money, but for her. To protect her secrets. Cresac found out, Martin said. "And he used it against both of you." She nodded. Cresac was always a vulture. He saw an opportunity, and he took it. But he underestimated Benoit's devotion. That was his mistake. Martin took a slow breath, the weight of it all settling upon him. "Benoit won't let you take the fall. He's already confessed." Her expression faltered for the first time. "Of course he has." Martin watched her closely. "Do you love him?" A silence stretched between them. Then, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. Yes. Martin considered his next words carefully. He had the truth now, the last piece of the puzzle. And yet, standing there in the dim candlelight, watching this woman who had spent her life trapped by the choices she had made, he wondered if justice was as clear-cut as it seemed. Finally, he said, "You should go to him." Madeline lifted her gaze to his, searching for something in his face. Then, without another word, she moved past him, out into the night. Martin remained in the quiet room, staring down at the letter in his hand. Then, slowly, deliberately, he let the paper slip into the flickering candle flame as the fire consumed. The last of its secrets he turned away. The case was closed. But justice, he thought, was never as simple as it seemed. The embers of the burned letter had long since cooled, yet the weight of what Martin had done lingered like an aftertaste of bitter wine. He had destroyed the final piece of evidence, an action neither lawful nor entirely justifiable, and yet, deep in his bones, he knew it was the right decision. Justice, as the courts understood it, would never account for the tangled complexities of the human heart. He stepped out into the courtyard, the crisp air of early morning settling over the estate. The gendarmes had long since departed with Cresac in custody, and Benoit, weak but alive, had been taken to the hospital. The house, so recently filled with tension and unspoken truths, now lay silent. Martin found himself walking along the gravel path, his steps unhurried, his mind dissecting the events of the last few days. The case had seemed straightforward at first, a murder driven by blackmail, power, and self-preservation. But, as always, reality had been messier. Benoit had confessed, and in the eyes of the law that would be enough. His loyalty to Madeline had never wavered, not even as the noose tightened. He would take responsibility for Delacroix's death, though Martha doubted the courts would be merciful. There was no room in the law for love as a defense, and Madeline, she was gone. Not in the way of criminals who flee in the dead of night, but in the quiet, deliberate manner of someone who understands their fate has already been sealed. When he had given her the choice to run, to fight, or to face the consequences, she had chosen the path that neither condemned nor exonerated her. She had gone to Benoit to be at his side one last time. Martin stopped beneath an old, gnarled oak, his hands slipping into the pockets of his coat. The distant glow of the city was just visible beyond the horizon. He could still hear the faint echo of her final words to him, spoken with neither regret nor expectation. "I will not ask for your forgiveness, Inspector.
Only that you remember me as I truly am." And he would. A carriage approached from the distance, its wheels rattling against the uneven road. Martin straightened as Commissioner Brasseur stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the scene before settling on Martin. "It's done?"
the commissioner asked, though it was more a statement than a question. Martin gave a slow nod. "Cresac is in custody. Benoit has confessed." Brasseur exhaled, rubbing his chin. "And the Baroness?" There was a long pause before Martin finally said, "Gone." The commissioner's gaze lingered on him for a moment before he simply nodded. "Perhaps that's for the best." He adjusted his coat, the morning chill settling in. "And you? What do you make of it all?" Martin's lips curved in something that was not quite a smile. "That justice is never as simple as it should be." Brasseur chuckled dryly. "That's why you never became a judge." He clapped a hand on Martin's shoulder. "Come, There's paperwork to be done, and you know how I hate doing it alone." Martin let out a slow breath, casting one last glance at the house, at the secrets it still held within its walls. Then, without another word, he followed Brasseur toward the waiting carriage. The case was closed, and yet, as the wheels rolled forward and the estate disappeared into the morning mist, Martin could not shake the feeling that justice had not been served, only understood. As the carriage rumbled through the dimly lit streets, Martin gazed out the window, watching the estate fade into the distance. The case was closed, and yet something clung to the edges of his thoughts like an unfinished sentence, a whisper of something unresolved. Brasseur sat across from him, leafing through his notes, his expression weary but satisfied. "It was a clean resolution," he muttered, as though reassuring himself as much as Martin. Benoit confesses. Cresac's greed exposed. The Baroness disappears. Tidy, as these things go. Martin made a non-committal sound, his fingers tracing the rim of his hat. It was tidy. Too tidy. Justice had been served in one form or another, and yet the gnawing feeling in his gut refused to settle. The letter. It should have arrived. He had built the case on it, on the words it was meant to contain, and yet it had never reached its destination. Madeleine had claimed she burned it, and perhaps she had. But something about it still didn't fit. The letter was the trigger, the catalyst for Delacroix's death. And yet Martin reached into his coat, fingers brushing against the envelope. He had retrieved from Cresac's study the one Delacroix had written before his death, but never sent. He pulled it out, running his thumb over the brittle paper. He had meant to turn it in, to log it with the rest of the evidence. Instead, he unfolded it once more, scanning the words by the dim glow of the street lamps. To Madeleine it began, not Baroness, not Madame Cresac, but Madeleine. He had read it before, but now something struck him differently. Delacroix had not threatened her. He had pleaded. "There is something I must tell you, something I should have told you years ago. If you knew the truth, you would understand why I did what I did. Please, meet me. I can explain everything." Martin's brow furrowed. The letter was not a demand, it was an attempt at atonement. But what truth had Delacroix wanted to reveal, and why had Madeleine acted so decisively to ensure the letter never reached her hands? Brasseur cleared his throat, snapping Martin from his thoughts. "You're still brooding," he observed. Martin folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into his coat. "Something doesn't sit right." Brasseur sighed, rubbing his temples. "Martin, we've got a confession. We've got motive. We have the guilty parties accounted for." Martin turned his gaze back to the window, watching as dawn began to break over the city's rooftops. "Perhaps," he murmured. "Or perhaps we only have the story we were meant to find." Brasseur shook his head, exasperation laced with familiarity. "You never know when to let a case die." Martin didn't respond, because he knew the truth. A case never truly died. It simply waited, hidden in the spaces between certainty and doubt, lingering like a ghost. And this one, he suspected, was not finished with him yet.